Hello and welcome to another episode of The Savvy Entrepreneur. Today we have a real treat for you. We have the one, the only Brad Feld. If you don't know who Brad Feld is, you are in for a spectacular treat because Brad is one of the top investors in the United States and one of the people that I look up to most in entrepreneurship. He's been one of the forefront investors in the fitness industry and in technology in general. He has a degree from MIT and is quite possibly one of the smartest people I've ever spoken to. Enough talking about the man, let's meet him. Without further ado, here's Brad Feld. Thanks again, Brad. I really appreciate you joining us today.
Happy to be here.
So, Brad, I know there's probably not a right answer to this question, and I apologize for jumping right into the deepest part of this topic. But what is your take on Colorado opening back up?
So I think that we're really fortunate in Colorado to have a governor in Jared Polis, who I think is excellent. He's incredibly thoughtful, extremely data-driven, very empathetic, and he takes a big picture view across all of Colorado versus sort of a sectionalized view on one thing or the other. The approach to Colorado starting to open back up, I think, is both very, very thoughtful one, and one that's responsive to the dynamics of how COVID has impacted Colorado. What we tried to do in Colorado with a stay-at-home order, and using data over time to really make sure that we're paying attention to and monitoring what's happened. Colorado is an interesting configuration in terms of the geography of the state, where there's both an urban corridor, a significant percentage of the state that's very distributed, with relatively little population per square mile, lots of small towns distributed across the state, but also has a vector from out of state because of the ski resorts. And, Colorado as a state was hit very hard early on in this crisis because of the amount of infection that came through the industry, basically the ski industry in the spring, some international and some from the east and the west coast. And so the spread was very geographically broad across the state versus just concentrated in the metros. And I think as Jared and the team at the state understood that, as the local public health departments dealt with it, as a public health system from a county perspective versus a state view, addressed it. And given the dynamics of how the state of Colorado works from a both public health perspective and a governance perspective, my view is it has been extremely well done. I'm hopeful that people will continue to be thoughtful and careful over the next couple of months. But I think that the data that we have in the state now and the systems that we have in the state that monitor and react reasonably quickly to any disease spikes without having the risks that we had before the shutdown, which was that our health system would be completely overwhelmed.
Yeah, we're really lucky to be in a state with those types of infrastructures and leadership. So, yeah, we are quite lucky. Now, to complicate the issue of COVID, we have the Black Lives Matter riots and protests that are currently going on. What is your take on that?
Well, at some level it's complicated. At some other level it's not that complicated. At the surface, as you get deeper, it's much harder. Just to be explicit on my perspective, I'm strong in the Black Lives Matter movement. I think that structural racism in our country has existed for a very, very long time. I have tried to, with my wife Amy over the years, be helpful and supporters of organizations that try to address racism and eliminate racism. At the same time, I don't feel like I individually, especially in my role as an investor, have done nearly enough, both in terms of being inclusive in my investment activity or at a personal level, active enough to eliminate racism in the country. So I regret that I haven't been more active, and I'm committed right now to becoming more active in again eliminating racism. Very clearly, I think is evil. Um, I think that one of the great things about the U.S. is the idea of protests and peaceful protests. I'm an incredibly strong supporter of that. I wish everybody would wear masks. Um, I understand the challenge and the dynamics, especially in a protest where, a tragedy, that is, essentially police violence and the murder of a black man. What the level of anger that incents. But at the same time, I think that peaceful protests are incredibly important. I think the rioting and looting is starts to become a harder problem. Um, Part of the harder problem. There was a video by Killer Mike uh, over the weekend. It was an impromptu thing that he did in Atlanta, spectacular, where his response was, am I something like, am I angry? Yes. Do I want to burn down everything? Yes. But I don't want to burn down my own house. Let's not burn down our own house. And I think this is where it is so challenging, which is that the anger and the hostility and just the need to express that anger is something that I'm empathetic to. And at the same time, over a period of time, the both the destructiveness of it, but also more importantly, the police reaction to it. It's a really difficult balance. And we've seen continued bad police behavior in different places where peaceful protesters are disrupted, are arrested, are isolated, are threatened, and that's just not okay as far as I'm concerned. And so, understanding that we're in an incredibly heated moment, I think as an individual, while I'm not an advocate of violence, I'm not an advocate of riots. I'm not an advocate of looting. I'm trying to stay in a place where I understand what's caused it, be empathetic to it, but at the same time encourage, peaceful protest, encourage action in a way that's constructive and that's long term, and encourage people that are not understanding, engaging, or are reacting in hostile ways to now the protests to take a deep breath and check their actions and actually think about what's going on.
Yeah, and that's very big of you. I very much commend you on being a leader on this. So, hat off to you. Great job, Brad. On that topic, you've been very active in philanthropy for most of your life, as far as I know. Do you want to talk about some of your other philanthropic efforts that you've done?
Yeah, uh, I didn't understand philanthropy until I got involved with Amy, my current wife, Amy Batchelor. And I say my current wife, and that's an inside joke, so I probably shouldn't use it if she ever heard. Um, uh, Amy and I got married or we got together as a couple in 1990. And but prior to that, I really didn't have any exposure to philanthropy. And when we started going out, I think the first year that we dated, we gave away money to three organizations that were encouraged by her. One was the Mass AIDS Project, one was Wellesley College, where she went to school, and one was Planned Parenthood. And these were 20. We didn't have a lot of money, but it was the ability to support these organizations that were meaningful. And over time, that expanded. One that's a fun one, which is we've been giving and supporting the Nature Conservancy since the mid to late 1990s. I remember the first year we gave them something, and Amy is now on the global board of the Nature Conservancy. They're a very large organization and a very large philanthropic commitment of ours. And the work that they've done over the last 20 or 30 years on conservation, and more recently in the last decade on climate, and on, not just advocating for certain activities, but from a research perspective, actually understanding what was going on in our world, on our planet, and making thoughtful and research activities around dealing with climate and dealing with the environment has been spectacular. We generally uh, uh, put our time and money into about 10 different types of things. We've been philanthropically contributing to social justice organizations for over 20 years. We've been doing a very specific focus on girls and women. We spend a lot of energy on entrepreneurship. I'm a big believer that entrepreneurship is, and education around entrepreneurship is something that has enormous impact on our planet and on our societies in general. Ability for anybody who wants to be an entrepreneur to be able to be an entrepreneur, and so on. So we have various focus areas that we contribute to. And what we've tried to do is not just put money into things, but in our own way. Amy is a big organization person. She loves being involved in very large organizations, and I'm very much a small organization, start things kind of person. So we've helped create a number of nonprofits. We've been the seed funder of a number of new nonprofits, some that have turned into quite large organizations. But we always try to engage, not by saying, here's our money and here's what we want you to do, but by instead contributing and saying, we're available to help in any way that's helpful to the organization. And so we try to take that frame of reference.
That's spectacular, Brad. Again, hats off to you, sir. So what advice would you give to someone who maybe is about to exit a venture and is looking to get into philanthropy, rather?
I think for me, it's the same answer that I give to people when they ask the same question, but say, I'm money and I want to become. And my view is it's better to take a portfolio approach than to put all of your energy and all of your money into one thing. And the reason for that is a function of a couple of different characteristics. One is I believe a very enjoyable part and powerful part of philanthropy is learning. And by engaging in organizations, you learn. The amount of things that I've learned about gender and gender inequity, and how to be a good male ally and how to actually be helpful as a male in a world supporting women in lots of different geographies and lots of different contexts, has really come from a perspective of participating and showing up in a number of organizations, which end up having years or a lot of impact, but others, an example there would be an organization that I got involved in at the very beginning, National Center for Women in Information Technology, that have had extraordinary impact. NC WIT's goal, it started in 2005, was to get more girls and women involved in computer science. I'm going to emphasize that year again, 2005, so 15 years ago. And the amount of impact that they've had on this, not just in terms of getting more girls and women involved in computer science, but helping do the research, understand what was going on, and then making systematic change broadly across both business and education from a research perspective, that then led to long-term change, has been remarkable. But for me as an individual, like, my understanding of the problem has come from the experience over this long period of time versus in 2005. I'm here. I know what to do. I'm a white male, but yep, I can totally fix women and I can totally fix this problem. Is completely counterproductive and not useful in any way, shape, or form. And so, taking a portfolio approach, picking a few things that are important to you, both intellectually and emotionally, and then spreading your time and your money across a handful of them, and then building from there. working with some large organizations, working with some small organizations, working with some close to home, working with some that aren't close to home, but view the learning part of the feedback loop as an important part of the engagement versus just a one-time engagement.
Great advice. So let's back up and talk about your first venture and how you got into investing from your first venture through your acquisition.
Not deliberate, not pre thought out or pre. I started a company with a partner. We self funded it. We didn't raise any money. We sold it to a public company 7 years later, and then that was in 1993. And between 1994 and 1996, I worked for the public company, but I also invested almost all of the money that I'd made from the sale in about 40 startups. I was in Boston at the time. I moved to Colorado in 1995 with Amy. But I was in my late 20s in Boston. I had some visibility as an MIT, software guy that was also involved in a bunch of entrepreneurial things back before people called them entrepreneurial things. And, 94 to 96 was the beginning of the commercial internet. And so I was just helping start companies. That was what my mental model was. And I was willing to write, $25,000, but also involved in helping start a bunch of these companies. I didn't know anything about investing when I made my first investment. I probably didn't know anything about investing when I made my 21st investment. But that was really the way that I just started doing it. I just started. And, my view was I was young enough that if I invested all the money and I got zeros out of everything, that was fine. I had plenty of earning power. As an entrepreneur, I could go, sort of do it again. Fortunately, many of those investments, or enough of those investments, were very, very successful that, my investing activity was successful. But, it's sort of, again, the learning cycle from doing versus studying or observing was what was essential for me.
That's a great parlay into our next question, which is, let's talk about what's investable. You've got a ton of experience. You're probably one of the most experienced investors I can think of. What would you say is your criteria for investability?
Well, I think it's a hard question to answer generically, because it varies quite widely, and it varies by investor. It varies by type of investor or type of organization that you're talking to, and it also varies by what the entrepreneur's current goals and aspirational goals are. And so, many of the companies that I've been involved in that had big outcomes were not ones that on day one you would say, wow, that company has the pedigree to be a successful business. One of the things that I've learned over and over again is that, that is one of the elements of bias in the system that's quite significant, which is, unless you've gone to the right school, unless you've got the right background, unless you've worked for the right companies, unless you've got the right network, unless the color of your skin is the right color, is the right gender, like those, as hard as people try to eliminate them, find their way in, and many people don't try very hard to eliminate those biases. I only invest in people who look like Mark Zuckerberg, great. That's not particularly helpful. Also, people have different strategies in terms of their investments. Foundry Group, we only make 10 investments a year. Techstars makes about 500 investments a year, right? So the dynamics of what you're looking to invest in are going to vary based on, firm, stage, and so forth. And so I think for an entrepreneur, I've tried to encourage over and over again that entrepreneurs not think of VCs as a category, as a singular thing. I like to talk about them as Dungeons and Dragons characters. And even firms themselves, collections. It's not that the firm has a singular archetype, but the firm might have 4 or 5 partners, and those 4 or 5 partners hopefully complement each other and extend the range of what they do. So I know that's not a specific answer in terms of what's investable, but I think that's the backdrop of how I think about it, which is there isn't a specific answer. Last comment I make is it changes over time. Are you talking about the people or are you talking about the idea? And, I think most investors are going to say yes. I'm thinking about both. a period of time not too long ago where if somebody said, I'm starting a startup in Boulder, Colorado, people would be like, whatever. And, today Boulder is thought of as a place where there's a large number of Boulder and Denver, a large number of high quality, both entrepreneurs and companies that have emerged from it. So when somebody says, I'm from Boulder, I'm from Denver, I don't think the reaction is, the reaction is, much different today than it might have. And that's, so I'm from Berlin. I'm starting a company. I'm in Berlin. Well, Berlin as an entrepreneurial hotspot 20 years ago was not something that people talked about. Berlin today as an entrepreneurial hotspot is quite relevant. So those things shift over time based on what's happening in the individual startup communities, along with what's happening across the broader macro.
I think that's very important for our audience because I think a lot of young entrepreneurs just think of VCs as like a homogenous group of people with money. And it's really not that case at all. And as you mentioned, each individual investor has, their paradigms that they like to invest in. And, some industries, like, for example, some people hate hardware investing, right?
Sure.
Some people hate pharmaceuticals, right? So it really does depend on paradigm.
I think I turn the word hate around too. Some people love a specific thing or specialize on a specific thing. So recognizing that it's not just I don't want to do this, that I'm particularly useful or good over here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So on that topic, how does team and company culture play in your decision for investing into a company?
So I don't like the word culture. I like to use the word cultural norms, because I think the word culture is too generic and it's too much. It's abused in terms of what people mean by it, and in a lot of ways, culture. There's a phrase that I particularly dislike, which is culture fit. I don't think companies should be looking for employees that have culture fit. I think they should be looking for people to add to their team that are culture add. And so I like to use the word cultural norms because I think companies can define their cultural norms. But those cultural norms do evolve, and they do extend and change and modify based on the people that you bring into the company and where the company goes over time. I am, and my partners at Foundry are less focused on the cultural norms a priori in a measurable way, and more focused on. I like to say there's three areas that are particularly interesting to us, which is first, do we have an affinity for the thing that the entrepreneurs are doing? Do we care about it? Doesn't mean that we have to be daily users of it, but do we care about it? The second is, are the founders, are the entrepreneurs obsessed about what they were doing? Not passionate, but obsessed. It's really easy, especially if you're an extrovert, to fake passion, whereas it's quite hard to fake obsession. So, were you put on this planet to do this thing? And then the third is, do they want us to be investors in their company as much as we want to be investors in the company? So it has to be a bi-directional desire on both sides. And I think those are the characteristics that we're focused on. Than, ephemeral thing, like culture that's very, very hard to define and understand. The other comment I make here is one of the things that I've learned over and over again is that, at least from my perspective, people are much more important than the idea. But the idea is price of admission. If the idea isn't an interesting one, again, affinity for the thing that people are working on, or it's not a thing that you're working on that you're going to stick with, even if you evolve it, adjust it, pivot, whatever word you want to use, that's kind of the starting point. But once you get past that starting point, especially at the early stages, I put much more focus on people.
Great advice. Let's talk more about investing. Now, there's been some new developments in allowing just about anyone to invest into startups. What do you think about those platforms that allow just the regular Joe to invest into startups?
I'm a fan of them. I'm a fan of the Jobs Act. I've never really understood why people could go to Vegas and gamble, but weren't legally allowed to invest in startup companies. I think that there's lots of opportunism around anything like this. So there's a lot of organizations who focus on, making their money by trying to be intermediaries. I think some of the intermediaries in terms of marketplaces or organizations are quite good. And the best ones are the ones that invest themselves in companies, and have an investment focus in addition to a marketplace or coordination or community focus. But generally speaking, I'm a big fan of the idea of democratizing investing in the early stage. I think it comes with a lot of education. Who buys a Bitcoin, better be ready for the Bitcoin to be worth what it's worth today, zero, or some big number in the future. And somebody says, that could never happen. I give them the long list of other altcoins. People to think that they were very, very wealthy on paper, and then because of the hodl dynamic, ended up being worthless or close to worthless. Same thing with investing, right? You can have a company that the important thing I like to say is to know the difference between 0 and 100. You're not playing for 2 times your money or 3 times your money. You're playing for 100 times your money if you're an early stage investor, because a lot of the companies you're going to invest in are going to go to zero. And if you only invest in one company, then again, this portfolio approach concept is not going to be particularly effective as an investor. You certainly can over-invest in too many companies. Strategies, clarity on what you're trying to invest in, how many companies you're trying to invest in, and then understanding this notion of, a single company that's worth 100 times your money. If you've invested the same amount in all 100 companies, if the other 99 companies are zero, you're break even. Very, very powerful. And oh, by the way, if one of those companies in that mix is worth 2 or 3 or 5 times the money, all of a sudden you're positive. And if 2 of the companies are worth 100 times your money out of that 100, you've doubled your money, even if the other 98 are zero. So just understanding that level of the investment cycle, whether you're investing $1,000 at a time or $10 million at a time, I think that's pretty important.
Great advice. On the topic of raising funds, I've heard you say in other interviews that fundraising is either very easy or very, very hard. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
And there's a lot of cliches for it, but companies that have a relatively easy time of raising money, which, by the way, is not predictable in advance. There's a lot of trendiness in investing. So when something becomes trendy, if you find yourself FOMO, right? If you find yourself working on something that's trendy, if you happen to be part of a network that suddenly was all connected to a company that just had a liquidity event, or you're doing something that looks similar to something else that just had a meaningful liquidity event, but where people think there's lots of future opportunity. 2 years ago, it might have been impossible to raise money for that company, and now it's easy. So if there's no absolutes, but it tends to be the case that most companies have a much harder time of raising money than the ones that have an easy time of raising money. And I like to try to encourage entrepreneurs to have the right expectation around the other is shift very quickly. Who would have predicted that, at the end of March, everybody would be living in their houses doing video conference, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
WeWork didn't.
Right? And whether you're an existing company that depends on people going to the office and depends on people traveling, and all of a sudden your company is in extreme distress, or whether you're a company that hasn't raised any money yet, where that has that kind of dependency, and all of a sudden everybody says, I'm not investing in that stuff right now. Or, there was a period of time, I've been investing in hardware-related companies for a long time. There was a period of time, especially around the success of Fitbit, which was one of our investors, where consumer electronics companies became very popular. And then, within a couple of years, it was virtually impossible to do anything other than raise an early-stage round for consumer electronic companies. Right?
Yeah, Fit, remember that one?
And so, it's on end, and as an entrepreneur, again, this is why it's so important to be obsessed about what you're doing. You have to be doing this for a reason, rather than just being random about it.
Great advice. One thing that's always been very difficult for me to advise people on is when to walk away. Do you have any advice on when it's time to hang up the boots or hang up the gloves and walk away?
I don't have generic answer to this one either. I think it is the day where you realize that you're doing things for the wrong reasons, and you get to define what the wrong reasons mean. There are different versions of the wrong reasons, and one version is the only reason I'm doing this is because I feel an obligation to get money back to my investors. That's the only reason I'm doing this. That's the wrong reason. The investors invested in your company. It's part of the entrepreneurial cycle. And if the only reason you are still doing this is because you feel like you have to get money back to your investors, you're no longer obsessed about the thing you're doing. It's no longer, the reason that you're spending your time on this planet working on something. Yeah, you might end up being successful ultimately, but probably not. Another is when you changed what you're doing so many times that you no longer even really know why you're doing what you're doing. And this is a common phenomena, especially in entrepreneurs that have been through multiple business models, multiple product ideas, multiple partners, multiple leaders. Like you still have a vision of a thing you want to create, but you've sort of worn out the system on it. And in some cases, if you're still obsessed about it, it makes sense. But in a lot of cases, just stepping back, this is no longer the thing that I want to do. And maybe that's the generic answer for me, is using this notion of obsession at the core. If you're still obsessed about what you're doing, stay on. If you're not anymore, if you're just doing it for some other reason, ego, fear of failure, fear of addressing what's going on, a feeling of obligation that's probably inappropriate, like take a step back and be real with yourself.
Wow, that's profound. So thank you for that. I'm hoping that other people are listening to this and use that as some really good advice. You've been an inspiration to me, and you really inspired me to do what I'm doing now. So thank you. And I wanted to ask you, who were people that you looked up to when you were a young entrepreneur?
I had a handful of heroes when I was doing my first company, and these were people who were visible to me. I didn't really have relationships with them, but I saw them from a distance, and I've had different levels of interactions with them as an adult, or sort of post my first company. The couple that come to mind immediately that are top of the list, Steve Case is right up there. I was always sort of fascinated with AOL. It emerged as a thing as my first company, was becoming a real company. And what Steve and his partners and people at AOL did was remarkable to me. But then how Steve continued to carry himself forward through the internet crash, and he committed both and business perspective to the next generation of businesses and entrepreneurs, as well as what he and his wife Jean have done philanthropically. I put them in the hero category for me. Another is Bill Gates. Bill, I didn't know Bill till well after, and I had never met him till well after I had sold that first company. I still don't know him particularly well, although I have several friends who are very close friends of his. But he's always been incredibly inspirational for me, even during the period of time where he was, leading Microsoft, which at the time was, I think, maybe the most successful company in the world, against incredible pressure of the government attempt to break up of Microsoft, the antitrust suits, the sort of view that he was, evil and if you look at that against the backdrop of what he's done with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and sort of the next phase of his leadership, not just in business but in society and philanthropically, it's been awesome. So that's another one. I lived in Boston at the time that Lotus had its big rise, and so Mitch Kapoor was always somebody who I just had incredible. I was going to say affection is not the right word though, but I looked at him and I just thought he was awesome, and I thought what Lotus did was awesome. And then I didn't really know him. I knew, encountered, some folks at Lotus, and while Lotus was there, while he was there, although of course he left at some point. And I got to know, and I've gotten to know and co-invest with Mitch and his wife Rhea Klein, and they're just incredible contributors to entrepreneurship, city and entrepreneurship. They're very clear thinkers. And they continue to be, and Mitch in particular continues to be a hero of mine. And then maybe the last one in this list, that's less, by some maybe less well known, is Dan Brickland. I was the very first computer I got was an Apple II, and one of the very first pieces of software we got for that Apple II was VisiCalc, which Dan and his partner Bob Frankston created the software, and then built a company around it. And I've had on and off relationship with Dan, not off bad, just in terms of lots of contact and not so much contact. But early on, he was always an archetype of an entrepreneurial founder that I was really attracted to, which was somebody who was extremely product centric, extremely focused on what the product was visionary, ahead of where the market was, but not really emotionally overwrought. Dan's had ups and downs. He's had some things that worked really well and some things that didn't. But he never, that spark of a desire to create great new things never went away. So those are some of my early entrepreneurial heroes. The last comment I make on that thread, the person who's had the most impact on me as an entrepreneur is a guy named Len Fassler. Len is the one of the two people that bought my first company. That was Len Fassler and his partner Jerry Pock. I have enormous regard for Jerry, but I've subsequently worked for and then done things with, invested with, and started a few companies with Len. And the way he approaches things, the way he's treated people, the way he approaches both the way I learned deals from Len and Jerry. I didn't really know how to do deals before I met either one of them. So sort of in the, gave you a chunk of my heroes, but like in the I learned the most, this is the one at the top of my stack. I would be remiss not to mention Len.
It sounds like an all-star team right there. Great people to pick.
Well, the only thing I regret as I go through my list is I don't have anybody in that group that's not a white male.
Ooh.
I'm very aware of that, especially in this moment. I mean, there's a number of in more recent times, a number of women entrepreneurs who have been incredibly impactful on me and who I view as heroes of mine. Two of them that I've learned an enormous amount, not just about business and entrepreneurship, but also about dynamics. Are Heidi Rosen, who I was business partners with at Mobius Venture Capital for a number of years, and then Lucy Sanders, who's the founder and CEO of an organization called National Center for Women in Information Technology. And I started working with Lucy in 2005, as I mentioned earlier with the NC Witt thing. And the amount that I've learned from her, not just about women in tech, but actually building a nonprofit and building a scaled organization as an entrepreneur has been incredible.
Yeah, what about Magic Johnson? What do you think about him? So just to throw someone out there, because I was thinking in my head, I'm like, who can I think of? Because I think it's maybe a function of timing, because back when those people were growing up through the ranks, there was even more systemic racism than there is now. But like, I'm thinking, who can I think of that may add diversity to that list?
Well, let's just state that Magic Johnson is. I've only met him once. I shook his hand. I was coming off stage and he was going on stage, or maybe the opposite, at Mark Suster's Upfront Summit. I think actually I was on the panel after him. So he had just done a panel and I was just getting on a panel. And I saw him for 1 minute, and he couldn't pick me out of a crowd. We don't have a relationship, but like just watching him talk, watching him engage entrepreneurs, the level of his leadership as an athlete, as a leader in an archetype and a model for people in I'd say the Black community, but also broadly in the U.S. and in society. I think his handling of an incredibly scary disease, HIV, and how he's as a person publicly, is incredible, and I think the way that he's functioning at this stage in life as an entrepreneur, an investor, and a mentor and a leader, and helping others is pretty awesome to observe. So while I wouldn't consider that I have a personal relationship with him. I would say that he's somebody that I look up to with an enormous amount of respect.
I completely agree. So, one thing that I wanted to discuss with you is breaking up of the big tech companies. What are your thoughts on an Elizabeth Warren type plan to break apart Facebook and some of those other large information companies?
Yeah, I'm not a fan. I would say that I'm not a fan partly because I'm not really sure I understand um, the actual dynamics and ultimate long-term motivations. Uh, I think the localization of things around innovation and around these large tech companies. I completely and totally respect the inequity and the concerns about balance of power and about allocation of resources and the dynamics with that. That said, um, I am not on the line of on the side of the line of these companies create um, enormous inequities in entrepreneurship because of their position. Uh, I would add that they're different companies. Amazon, Google, uh, Facebook, Apple, even Microsoft. Um, they're different companies. They have different strengths, different weaknesses, different cultural dynamics, um, different cultural norms. I would say on that list of companies, there's definitely situations of their business, and on the other end of the spectrum, even for the same companies, obviously the things that they provide as products and services are helpful and useful. And then there's plenty of cases, even when there's cultural norms that I think are abhorrent, there are also cultural norms that are quite positive. So I think it's a very challenging um, intersection of things. And if anything, I feel like as a participant in the broad entrepreneurial ecosystem, my job is probably not to, or I could say explicitly, my job is not to opine or advocate one way or the other for how large companies should be regulated by government and what those government dynamics should be. But instead, I'd rather focus most of my energy or all of my energy at the earlier democratizing entrepreneurship, having entrepreneurship be inclusive of anybody who wants to engage, regardless of pick your characteristics, and of being a sort of a long-term advocate and ally for people who historically haven't necessarily felt comfortable with entrepreneurship or haven't felt welcome in the context of entrepreneurship. I feel like that's a better use of my time and my energy than trying to figure out, the political side of it. But I find a lot of the public rhetoric to be not terribly useful, confused, polarizing, and not really that thoughtful.
Yeah. Well, your answer was definitely thoughtful. So,
It's not my goal either, but Amy and I joke a lot. It's a lot easier to score points than it is to affect change, and especially political points. And I couldn't give a shit about points because I don't care. I do care a lot about affecting change or trying to be involved and help affect change. That I at least I view as positive change. And when I'm wrong and I'm trying to either affect change that I'm unable to, or I'm affecting change and I realize that I'm affecting change that's not positive, acknowledging it, owning it, and modifying my behavior is the way I try to act, rather than reinforcing either an ineffective or bad position.
speaking of change, will we ever see a Governor Feld or a Senator Feld or potentially a President Feld?
No,
No.
no. And there's a variety of reasons, including that it's just not interesting to me in terms of how I spend my time. Um, I I think to be a successful politician, even to be good at governing, I think you have to be very, very interested in spending a lot of your engaging with people at a relatively shallow. And I'm not interested in that. I don't like it. It doesn't appeal to me. It doesn't feed me in any way, shape, or form. Um, I'd much rather spend my time with less people physically, more people virtually, and be able to, again, help from the bottom up. Especially at the early stages of things. So, when I view, those types of roles, those are, CEO-like roles over, broad parts of, you know, Governor of Colorado is the CEO of Colorado, President of the United States is CEO of the United States. Like, that's a mental model that you can map to, notwithstanding of whether that's the right way to think about it or not. And, I'm also very clear I don't want to be CEO of a company. So it's just not a role in a way that I personally thrive off of.
Yeah, everyone's got their own thing, right? And you've definitely done a great job of what you do enjoy doing. So
Indeed.
can't fault you for that.
Well,
Last thing I wanted to do with you is do something that I think would be very valuable to our audience, which is going over a very, very, very basic pitch for people to understand what goes into a good pitch to an investor. So during this, I am going to talk about one of my companies I'm involved with. This is not a solicitation for investment. This is purely for educational purposes, so everyone knows. And please feel free to interrupt me, and let's use this as an educational thing for our audience. Sound good?
go for it.
Cool. So the first thing I like to do when I'm talking about a company is talk about the problem that that company is solving. So I'm going to introduce the company and produce the problem that we are hopefully solving. The company is New Promethean, and we produce radiation shielding for aerospace. The problem is that in aerospace, there's a lot of radiation in outer space, beyond the magnetosphere. Now, if we're going to realize the potential of space travel and exploration, we're going to have to find a solution for radiation, because it not only harms the person, the astronaut, but also the electronics that are in space. So that would be the problem. And the solution would be our product, which is radiation shielding. That phase one, our initial testing has blocked a third of gamma radiation and 100% of radiation going all the way to X-ray. And this will allow more sophisticated electronics and deeper space exploration. So those are the problem solution. Let's unpack that a little bit. Brad, what do you think?
Well, first question that prompts for me is, how does that compare to existing solutions? So, my general view is in the first 60 seconds of any, pitch or conversation with a prospective investor, you want to say, cover two things, and you did both of these reasonably well, which is, what do I do and why do you care? Those are the two questions I want to answer. And specifically, what do you do and why should I care? I got the what you do. The why I care, what's missing is against the backdrop of existing solutions, right? If your new solution is 10 times or 100 times better than existing solutions, okay, I care about that. If your approach is 1.1 times better than existing solutions, I'm not sure I care that much.
Great point. And is there a particular multiple that you're looking for? I've heard some people say it has to be at least 50 to 80% better than the current solutions.
Yeah, I think the cliche that generally exists, certainly in software, is 10x better. So not 50 to 80%, but 10 times.
Okay.
1,000
Yeah.
better. I think really what's important is that it be not quantify it a certain way, and you've got multiple different things that can be better, right? The efficacy of the product could be better, the price point could be better, could be lower, your distribution approach, your selling approach could be better. So there's lots of different characteristics, but sort of when you add all that stuff up, it's like the existing way people do it is X, and the way I'm doing it is 10x better. Like, that's a good heuristic to try to get somebody to really lean forward and say, "Whoa, that's something."
Great advice. So the next two that I have on my list is the market and the team. So discussing the market opportunity and talking about how, in space, power is at a premium. So if you can find a new way to produce power, especially as you get further away from the sun, because as you get further away from the sun, the less solar rays are available to collect solar power. That would be really important to the space exploration. So one of the things that we do is convert the gamma radiation into electricity. That's on our roadmap for 2 years from now. And the team, because this is a multidisciplinary endeavor, we have a wide range of PhDs, from EEs to physicists to chemists to aerospace engineers, and even a lonely MBA to lead the project.
So I think that on the market, again, in a short discussion, it's hard. It's hard to describe the scale of the market, and I generally think that examples of customers that you have or examples of customers that you're targeting is as important or even more important than defining the size and scale of the market. So it's always useful to have a specific example so the investor knows who the buyer is or who the customer is. In terms of the team, super important, and I would say the more precise you can be. Doesn't have to be Joe Smith, but that they worked at Boeing and they worked on this team and Mary Jones and she worked at on this team at SpaceX. Like that's helpful, and sort of describing what that founding team looks like and how they're going to work together. And I wouldn't deprecate even the lowly MBA. Like sometimes it's cute, but in general, I would just be don't create prejudgments by the investor, the different categories, because you don't know how they think about what the team. And again, it's in some ways it's a verbal cuteness, but I it's a minor issue. But I wouldn't self-deprecate in any way, shape, or form about what you're doing.
Okay, great advice. And then finally, the last thing that everyone has got to include is the ask. We are looking for $2 million, and that is going to be used to go to market and to produce our first prototypes for our first customers, which include two of the top 5 aerospace companies.
Yeah, so generally speaking on the ask, especially in the short pitch, is more framing than anything more. In other words, I don't know what $2 million really gets you. I don't know how much time it gets you in terms of runway. I don't know how you've really thought about it. And so more it's dollars. It's useful if you've got any of that money raised, or you've got commitments for any of that money to say, look, I'm raising $2 million. I got $500,000 that's committed. We don't have a lead investor yet. We're looking for a lead investor, or we have a lead investor that's willing to do $1 million, and we're looking for another $1 million to fill in with it. Like just a little more color around it, so that it's clear, where I fit in as a potential investor. Oh, I'm writing $25,000 checks. You're raising $2 million. Call me later. You're raising $2 million and you've got $1.8 million of it done, and you're looking for the last bit to fill in, and you're calling me because you think I can help you in this particular way. Well, my $25,000 might be interesting.
Great advice. So do you have any other suggestions for the key points someone wants to hit during a pitch?
Well, I think the only thing that the short version you touched on a little, but I go deeper on it, is exactly how the product works or exactly what the product is. So I put a little bit more texture around that. I get that it's radiation shield, but how does it work? When you're building a spaceship, you need, this is 20% of the spaceship bill of materials is shielding for this part of it, or 1% of the bill of materials is shield. It has to be installed, early on. It has to be designed into the actual thing, or it's something that's installed after the fact because it works with, any of the existing, spaceships that exist today. Just a little more color around what the product is and how it works is useful.
Yeah, totally. You're absolutely right. That is something that should be happening. I appreciate it, Brad. You've been so awesome about this. I really have to say thank you again. You're really a gentleman and a scholar, so thank you. Appreciate it, sir.
My pleasure. Talk soon.
Thanks, Brad.
I hope you enjoyed watching that video as much as I enjoyed recording that video. I had a great time speaking with my idol, Brad Feld. Until next time, stay savvy.